professor of moral theology and ethics at Catholic University of America. He is also the executive director of a really important and powerful institute there at the Catholic University of America, which is the Institute for Human Ecology. They have partnered often with Baylor in Washington. We've enjoyed participating together on a panel. I know Joseph Capizzi, and I'm really excited that he said yes to come here and give a talk on Augustinian and Thomistic political theology. It was kind of a gift that fell into our lap. We have a mutual friend named Mark Tooley. Tooley runs the Institute of Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C. It's a Protestant think tank of sorts. They put out the journal Providence. And he emailed me a few weeks ago and said, we would love to have students talk more about political theology. And to that end, here's a list of 25 people I would pay to have come to your campus. And Capizzi was on the list, and I said, I'll take Capizzi immediately, please. I think I was the first one to respond. I said, I want Joe to come. And it's worked out, and by the grace of God, he's here. His flight was canceled, but he hopped in a rental car at Dallas, and he arrived the exact same minute I did about 3 minutes ago. So we're lucky to have him. Joe Capizzi, welcome to Baylor.
Thanks, David, so much for that introduction. I do enjoy working with you guys. You guys are fabulous, and Baylor is a great university. At the Candler School of Theology, I got a master's degree there, which is in the Methodist tradition. So I think I'm, relatively versed in different perspectives on things. So I'm going to make an argument today, and the argument's kind of like a self-contained little unit, little space that I'm claiming within political theology, but I range much more widely over it, and since this may be new to some of you and perhaps even a little bit foreign sounding to some extent, don't hesitate to ask any sorts of questions. You feel free to, sort of to pet the animal or whatever. You're getting an opportunity to talk to, a real live Catholic theologian from the Catholic University of America, which, we call ourselves the Bishop's University. I am actually pontifically approved, which means my whole file went to Rome, and Rome looked it over and said, at least at that point, it looks okay. They haven't probably looked at it recently, not that I think there's any problems on it. So, again, don't hesitate to ask anything that strikes your mind or about anything that you think that I raised and that I don't quite fully explore. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the problem of authority, more or less, and what I'm calling the necessity of politics. And you'll see there are different reasons why I think it's important to start talking about these things again. For many decades, social commentators have been aware of a crisis of authority across the entire spectrum of social phenomena in which authority typically resides. There have been many prominent cartographers of this crisis of authority, including the political theorist Hannah Arendt, who's a Jewish theorist from the middle of the 20th century, who was quite prominent in exile, and a really brilliant thinker. Her writings remain popular in part because of her description of this crisis of authority. Authority, she wrote in 1954, has vanished from the modern world. For Arendt, the comprehensiveness of authority's crisis undermined the possibility of politics itself. In her book, The Human Condition, and essays like The End of Tradition, she describes a modernity marked by the eclipse of authority that diminishes the capacity for individual action and ultimately politics. She describes a situation so dire, even such pre-political areas as child rearing and education have succumbed to the devastation of authority. Unique because of their natural necessity, their loss, she argues, strips us of these powerful models, that is, like child rearing, education. These are powerful models for a great variety of forms of government that depend upon authority. We are left no longer in a position to know what authority really is. Okay, that's her claim. According to Arendt, modernity has witnessed the demise of man, therefore, as a political animal, and his transformation into what she calls a working animal, an animal laborans, an anonymous, powerless labor. Taken together, she argues, these conditions make mass society possible and create the conditions for human manipulation by propaganda and despotic governance. Liberals and conservatives, she adds, have been equally powerless to make sense of these changes, and arguably each side contributes to them. Put differently, the problem that she's diagnosing
the loss of authority, and the vulnerability of the masses to manipulation and despotism is not a left-right problem. Neither side is equipped to fix it. In the United States, the combination of the pandemic and partisan reactions to it, the catastrophic end of an equally catastrophic 20 years war, assaults on elected processes and disorder in major cities, and a continuing series of sexual crises among religious leadership have cemented the apparent demise of authority. To many elite and popular critics, political, religious, and even military leadership have ranged from incompetent to impotent. According to Pew, trust in government is at an all-time low, and that is a 2017 study. The situation is no better in our churches. Within the Catholic Church, the one I know better, right, and I'm sure you've all seen the news, the authority of the American bishops is challenged routinely by renegade priests and lay persons when the bishops are not challenging each other. Likewise, breaking centuries of unspoken commitment not to undermine the public's regard for the military leaders have each taken to the press to attack each other. Finally, the scientific community, having enjoyed a decades-long tour of unchallenged authoritativeness, has finally run aground in the shallow waters of a deeply politicized pandemic. Follow the science has proven as effective as a teacher yelling at his class to pay him attention. As Aaron described in the 1950s, populist, nationalist, and illiberal forms of governance have emerged coincident with this near comprehensive evacuation of common sources of authority. The ground finds itself plowed, seeded, and fertilized yet again for new modes of despotism. The connection between the demise of authority and threats to human freedom has been apparent for some time. For some, of course, the demise of authority corresponds to the growth of reason and thus to freedom, as authority is understood as always extrinsic to the person and the community. In this view, freedom blossoms as authority withers. Authority, always external to the human subject, guides or commands from the outside. Sometimes, of course, that guidance may coincide with the desires or the intentions of the subject, but such an alignment is only coincidental and not an expression of the true subjectivity of the person. Located outside the person, authority appears inessential to personal flourishing. One can contingently assent to the impress of authority, but that assent is only temporary and in some way substitutional for the person's capacity for judgment. For instance, I can substitute the authority of a nutritionist to help me set up a diet for my health. But she serves that role only because I have chosen, for whatever reason, not to learn what she knows and to substitute her knowledge and her guidance for my own. As I grow in wisdom or knowledge, as my reason expands, the rationale for substituting her authority for my own would no longer exist. I could get a book on nutrition, learn as much as she knows, and set about constructing my own diet. There's nothing essential about my relationship to my nutritionist. This is hypothetical, right? Clearly I don't need one, right? I'm a model of fitness. I need only the time and the will to augment my reason and to be gone with her. The key for seeing this way, this way of seeing the relationship of freedom and authority is in terms of the will. The person must take the lead, exercise courage to follow him or herself alone. The person would be truly independent at that point, truly free. Kant's description of this right is, of course, the most famous one for modern thinking, and that's the one that comes in his essay, What is Enlightenment, from 1784. This is like the canonical statement of authority's relationship with the subject. I'm sure many of you read it. I'm just going to read you a passage or two from it from the very beginning. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed nonage, right? His childhood or his immaturity. This is the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance, right? It's self-imposed, right? This immaturity is self-imposed if its cause lies not in a lack of understanding, but indecision and a lack of courage to use one's own mind without another's guidance. Dare to know, Kant tells us, right? Have the courage to use your own understanding. That is the motto of the Enlightenment, he continues. He goes on, laziness and cowardice are the reasons why such a large part of mankind gladly remain minors all their lives. Minors, adolescents, right? not in coal mines and things. Long after nature has freed them from external guidance. They are the reasons why it is so easy for others to set themselves up as guardians. It is so comfortable to be a minor. If I have a book that thinks for me, a pastor who acts as my conscience, a physician who prescribes my diet, and so on, I have no need to exert myself. I have no need to think, if only I can pay. Others will take care of that disagreeable business for me. Again, fear, weakness of will in particular, laziness, cowardice. This is what prohibits us, right, from becoming truly free, according to this understanding of things. We do not need authorities. They are not essential to our flourishing. In this model of authority and its relationship to the person, there is, as Joseph Ratzinger, who's a Catholic theologian, right, who became Pope Benedict XVI, there is no bridge between the subject and the object of authority. There's nothing that can take us from me, right, as sort of the essential authority, to something external to me, what I understand to be external to me. And that thus everything which does not come from me is some sort of violence on me, right? If I allow it into my life, if I allow it to become an authority for me, it actually acts as a kind of constriction on my own freedom. Humans then are liberated from situations of oppression when they slough off these external authorities, allowing new forms of community to emerge. So it's not simply a kind of subject-object relationship or individual relationship. It actually pertains to the kinds of communities that we're going to inhabit. He continued this in a document he wrote called Spe Salvium, on hope, where he writes, progress is understood, progress to this account, right, to modern thinking on these kinds of questions, is understood as the overcoming of all forms of dependency. It is progress towards perfect freedom. Likewise, freedom is seen as a promise in which man becomes more and more fully himself. In both concepts, freedom and reason, there is a political aspect. So it's not merely, again, an individual question. The kingdom of reason, in fact, is expected as the new condition of the human race once it has attained total freedom. The political conditions of such a kingdom of reason and freedom, however, appear somewhat ill-defined. Reason and freedom seem to guarantee by themselves, by virtue of their intrinsic goodness, a new and a perfect human community, a community without authority. In other words, the continued rise of reason, the correlated diminishment of authority will produce a community of self-ruling individuals with no need of political authority. Recall Arendt's point about the replacement of political man with laboring man. We will not need politics, in other words, in this kingdom of reason. Right? It would again be some sort of external intrusion on our own exercise of our own reason and also our freedom. His skepticism, Pope Benedict's skepticism about this project is obvious. Like Arendt, he suggests the consequence of this conception of freedom and its relationship to authority portends tyranny. It's actually, right, this is actually not going to bring a kingdom of reason into being. It's going to bring it into being a kingdom of tyranny. These are false views of the relationship of authority, the person, and life and community. These views promise freedom, they promise new forms of community, but they offer instead oppression and variations on tyranny. This assault on tradition and legitimate forms of authority, church, political, and so on, leads to the demise of those sources of authority. Instead of freedom, their disappearance. Churches, political institutions, other social institutions in which human beings typically have sort of made their lives, including the family, right, as Arendt pointed out, will eventually disappear, and it exposes human beings as individuals to the operations of more and more authoritarian forms of governance, or so is Arendt's claim, so is Pope Benedict's claim, and so others argue as well. Of course, they argue, I agree, that human beings actually need authority. Our dependence upon authority is not a limitation of our freedom, but in fact is necessary to our freedom. Of course, the mere fact of the human need for authority, which I think is an essential need, it's built into who we are as human beings, exposes human beings as individuals and communities to abuse and neglect in authority's name, right? And the kinds of instances that I described, like for instance, the stuff that's going on in the Catholic Church, the stuff that's going on in other churches in the United States, right? In part is a consequence of people's essential need for authority. They're yearning for authoritative figures to act well, right, and making themselves vulnerable to authoritative figures acting really poorly, right? So this need does expose us to abuse and neglect in the name of authority. The response to this from the classical tradition, from Plato through Aristotle to the major figures of the Christian tradition, including, of course, Augustine and Aquinas, connects the necessity and the exercise of authority, both the necessity of authority and its exercise, to truth. It begins with the assertion that we are the certain kinds of beings that need authority. Okay, so it begins with a truth claim. This is the kind of being we human beings are, right? To be a human being is to be a being that needs authority, which is itself a truth claim. That it begins also with a claim that the genuine exercise of authority connects to truth, right? In order for for authority to be acting well, it has to be connected to truth. And in particular, to the specific sorts of truths that are dependent upon the nature of the authority. For instance, medical or scientific truths in the case of the medical or scientific authorities, and political and historical truths in the cases of political and historical authorities. When utterances of these authorities are shown to be false, especially intentionally false, not only do these utterances cease to bear the gravity of authority, the sources of the utterances, the authorities themselves, suffer a decrease in their authoritativeness. People resist the exercise of authority that they no longer trust. Again, think just of the pandemic and what it's doing to us. We have all seen this, right, very recently. The pandemic, in part, has not merely exposed that the crisis of authority has affected political and scientific authority. I think an argument could be made the pandemic was caused to some extent by those crises, much as famines are almost always a combination of political and natural catastrophes. We were simply unprepared to respond adequately, in part, because of the collapse of authority we've been discussing, including the demise of our trust in the truth orientation of these authorities, political authorities, medical authorities, scientific authorities, and so on. Authority, then, according to the classic account, which I consider myself a part of trying to rehabilitate, proceeds in relationship to its ordering towards truth. When shown to be consistently false or mistaken, or to have no regard for truth at all, it is exposed as about power alone. And again, Ratzinger wrote, man's capacity for truth is in fact a limit on all power. Right? We are truth-seeking beings. The kind of truth claim about what kinds of beings we are, and that truth-pursuing capacity does and ought to limit power. If this analysis is right, we should not welcome but fear what we are seeing, which is the demise of the institutions that we associate with politics, right? Their collapse is coming right, sort of happening right in front of us. We are entering what some people are referring to as a kind of post-political age, and for people who believe that we are political beings, right, this is not a utopia, this is not the kingdom of reason, but in fact a kind of nightmare that we're watching come into being. Often, to say that we are, as I just did very, very quickly, political beings in our sort of essence, is seen as a point of departure between the Protestant and Christian traditions. And I want to, actually, Protestant and Catholic traditions. That was a slip, right? Oops. It's just how we think around the water fountain where I am. I want to sort of wind my comments down at this point. I'll finish up with a couple of comments on this, where I think there's more commonality, in part traceable to the sort of relationship of Augustine and Thomas to each other. So, like I said, this is often seen as a point of departure between Protestant and Catholic thinking, in particular as the point of a divergence between Catholicism as understood as following Thomas Aquinas, and variants of magisterial Protestantism following Augustine. Catholic Thomism, this kind of reaction goes, embraces the essential sociality of man and his related need for life and political community, while often, right, people claim Protestant Augustinianism rejects this. Man by nature may be social, but not political. Political society, according to this view, is a consequence only of human sinfulness, right? Had humans not sinned, there would be no need either for politics or authority. It's a sort of typical assault, right, against this kind of Protestant approach, or this read of Augustine. You can see that if in fact that read is true, right, you're only a few steps away from that view that political society is only a consequence of the fall. In other words, it's not essential to man, to perhaps getting to where I was describing before, where you have human beings searching for a non-political society, a kind of kingdom of reason that will be truly liberating, right? And this is often, if you read bad Catholic theologians these days, you'll see them blame everything on Protestantism, right? It's because of certain developments in Protestantism that we find ourselves with Kantian views or other sorts of Enlightenment views that they're connecting sort of very quickly to certain kinds of Protestant moves. The reaction to that claim, I think, is manifestly false, right? And quite frankly, makes Protestantism and Augustine seem rather foolish. Of course, there are important differences between and within the two traditions, the sort of Augustinian tradition and the Thomistic tradition, and in particular regarding the place of coercion in politics. But on the essential political nature of the human being, we all should agree. And by this, I do mean a political nature requiring life in a political community, requiring the exercise of authority. Let me provide one example to finish my comments. So we're going to go to Augustine, the City of God, right, which at least some of you will have perhaps read a little bit of, right? Maybe all of you have read a lot of. So if so, congrats to Baylor. So in the City of God, Book 12, Augustine focuses on God and his creative activity, seeking to defend Christian biblical claims. In chapter 22 of that book, he points out that God's choice to create the human race in one man distinguishes the human race from other animals, some of which God made solitary and lone-ranging, and some he made gregarious, right? So he's talking about how God created the world, and in particular how he created the different kinds of animals, of which humans, of course, are a certain kind of animal. He created human beings through one man. And on the other hand, he created animals in a different way. And some of these animals are quite different. Some are solitary and lone range. They hang out on their own, right? They do their own thing. Some are gregarious. They live in society. In both cases, with regard to the non-human animals, all animals were produced not from a single individual as human beings were, right? There's not one lion, right? Or armadillo, or roach, right? There were roaches, and there were whales, and there were things like that, right? There's, however, as we know, one human being. The reason God did this, Augustine argues, is plain, and this is a quotation. Not that man might be alone and bereft of human society, but by this means the unity of society and the bond of concord should be commended to him more forcefully. Mankind being bound together not only by similarity of nature, like, say, lions and eagles, right? They're bound together by their similarity of nature, but by the affection of kinship. So he's arguing, right, by creating us in this way through one being, God is cementing a kind of sociality in human beings like kinship, right? That's sort of always calls us back, right? Human sociality, kinship even, is the essence of the human being. It is built into God's creation of all men, including Eve, through Adam. Our unity is rooted in the moment of our creation. That is not the end of the story, of course, but its beginning. For just as kinship is rooted in the one man, so is human sinfulness that results from the fall. Later in Book 12, he writes, there is nothing so social by nature as this race, no matter how discordant it has become through its own fault. Right? So nothing is as social as human beings are, he's claiming, in all of God's creation, because of this kin relationship that God exhibits to us through his creation of all human beings through Adam. Right? So there are some people who even deny sociality in Augustine. It's pretty clear. It's manifestly false, right? He makes this claim. But this is despite what we see, right? What we see is, if you just look at anybody, even if you look at a family, right, what you see is discord. Right? What we actually see is discord. Right? Human beings who live miserably with each other. Sorry to debunk any your views. Right? We're actually kind of miserable with each other, but the sociality is built into us nonetheless. We are naturally social, divided by our own activity. The essential unity of humankind, rooted in Adam, he continues, this is him again, admonishes man to preserve unity among the whole multitude. Okay? We constantly have to call ourselves back to this fundamental unity that is the nature, that is built into us, that is our essence. We cannot flourish, in other words, if we're not moving back towards sociality despite discord. He makes this point after acknowledging man's division by sin. The preservation of this unity is a human task given to human beings. What do we call that task? We call that task politics, right? That is what politics is, right? It is trying to drive people back towards a unity that is essential to them. Some people claim that Augustine may have conceded the essential sociality of the human being, but not a political sociality. That is, they argue he believed the need for politics stemmed from sin alone. The unity with any political community is sought by the activity of political authority or government, which exercises power to direct the community towards its shared love, primarily by protecting the innocent and punishing evil. Like much of the tradition that follows him, Augustine makes ample use of St. Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 13. God ordains government into being. Governments serve human goods by pursuing the more full expression of this original unity. But he adds in chapter 15 of book 12, which I've been citing from, that though God did not intend human beings to have lordship over each other, right? He does not intend human beings to have lordship over each other. That's not built into our essence, right? This kind of rule, the kind of rule that we associate with masters over slaves, or lords over their servants, their peasants. Instead, he did set into place the authority of the first just men as shepherds of flocks. Okay? That's a quote from him. He did set into place the authority of the first just men as shepherds of flocks. Now look, I've not spoken about how political authority is exercised, and I think there's clearly, in that space, in the exercise of political authority, there will be sort of deep differences between Augustine and Thomas. I'm merely trying to show that the Christian tradition, Catholic and Protestant at least, is invested in the reestablishment of authority that serves the human community, including political authority. There's no question, generally, that Augustinian and Thomistic inflections of political authority will differ. And I should add, there's different versions of Thomism, right? And there's different versions of Augustine, right? I mean, I'm trying to make that point about the different versions of Augustine for sure, but there's also different versions of Thomism, and there's also, believe it or not, non-Thomistic versions of Catholicism, right? There are people who are Bonaventuran or, phenomenological, right? There are very, very different ways of approaching things. Catholicism, right? Brings it all in at some point. There's no question generally that Augustinian and Thomistic inflections of political authority will differ, and again, particularly with regard to how we understand the operation of coercion, and perhaps also certain kinds of questions about the possibilities of government with regard to the development of virtue in individuals. However, there's no question, I think, that Augustine had a conception of political authority, one modeled perhaps more on the household, right, or the shepherd of the flock. And I submit that this is enough to enlist Catholics and Protestants side by side in the work of rehabilitating political authority. Thank you.
We'll take some questions. Who would like to ask a question?
And again,
Matthew.
Thank you for that talk. Fascinating. I'm interested in hearing you say just a little bit more about the nature of the crisis of authority in the sense that here's the idea which I do that we are political creatures. Then the attempt to live without the authorities would result oftentimes in just failure, performative self-contradictions, right?
Right.
It would display the failure of the attempt to live without authority, sort of solely by my own will, for instance, if that was the only authority.
Right.
So I'm interested in hearing you say more about that, and also the way then if that's right, then it would seem to suggest that the issue here is not just a crisis of authority, but a crisis of competing authorities. There will always be multiple authorities that people are appealing to, because in some way, fundamental ways, you can't live without authorities, right? If the argument that you're making is
That's right. That's right. No, look, that's a great question. Basically, I'm in complete agreement. I'm just going to talk through some ways that I think that this spells it out. So sometimes people who argue about a crisis of authority will make it seem as though there is no longer any authority, right? And maybe there are ways in which I was even saying that, right? But part of that's distinguishable from a claim that traditional sources of authority, right, have collapsed and been replaced by other ones, right? I think it's, in my mind, there's no question in essence that human beings are always looking for things to be authoritative, right? And so where churches and teachers and military, leaders and heroes and whatever else in the past may have served as authorities, they kind of find it locating somewhere else, right? So we can think of, obviously, technology, right? Technology is a space where it acts more or less authoritatively on our lives, and if you think of, well, what makes something authoritative, or what are the qualities of authoritative things, it's typically that when it commands, I will accede to the command almost without thought, right? If I respect my father or my mother or my doctor, and they say, make your bed or take your pills, I don't typically question it, right? Okay, my doctor said take the pills. He's seen my charts. I take the pills, right? We've often relocated it, I think, rather than it's just gone, right? And we've relocated it in weird things, right? Like, what does Taylor Swift think about politics, right? Like these kind of strange things matter. I'm sorry, I know Taylor Swift is a dated reference, right? But But these things matter for us. It's always kind of weird, or like again, around Catholics. I don't know if you guys do the same sort of thing. You'll do this every once in a while, and somebody like, oh my God, Aaron Judge is a Catholic, right? It's like, who cares? Like, but for some reason, that some figure is also on our team bears a kind of gravity for us in our community. So I think that's a great point. It's a complicated thing, I think, to describe really what this crisis is. And I think there are even different ways to approach what exactly is going on, right? And from one way of looking at it, you could trace it, and a very Catholic way to look at the story would be to trace it through the French Revolution, more or less, right? And say, like, look, you have the collapse of the borders, right, of French society, and the assertion of the egalitarian, right, relationships of human beings within those orders, and it kind of collapses typical sources of authority, right? The nobility, the clerics, and so on, and it replaces it with what? Well, something eventually does step in, right? It becomes extremely authoritative, right? And acts in manifestly despotic ways. So it's a great question, and you can tell I'd love to go on about it for a long time. Sorry, Julia, I said you had a hand up.
Yeah, so a somewhat related question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how your argument fits in with the readily observable phenomenon of tribalism, and whether it's not so much the collapse of authority as the selection of a particular authority that we wish to believe and follow, to the exclusion of others that we don't. So it's thinking about competing news networks, for instance. People tend to more or less accept, the authority of Fox or of CNN, but not of the other.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. No. Right. So in a way, it would track onto Matthew's question, right? In some ways, people are looking for sources of authority. I think the piece that I would also connect that to is the relationship to truth, right? And in what sense are these things, or do these tribal or rearrangements of things detach themselves from concerns about truth as opposed to affirmations of myself, right? So I see this a lot on Twitter, that Twitter becomes really a kind of affirmation of myself, both in the way that one curates one's followers and so on, and blocks, certain kinds of discordant voices, and the likes and so on. So I think it would track, to my mind, this would be part and parcel with the kind of analysis you're seeing Arendt do, but obviously much more contemporaries are doing as well as they look at the way technology is influencing a lot of this. It's about the subject, it's about me, right? And I am choosing which things are authoritative in my life, to some extent independent of whether they're true, and more whether they actually affirm my thinking or my feelings, perhaps more, you know. So it's a great point. I think I got.
Let me take one. I wanted you to know that's my theology colleague Matthew Whalen, and this is Matthew Lee Anderson with a question now.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much for the talk. It could be that I missed it, or that I guessed, but there's a real possibility.
Listen, this is always the preface to a sharp question.
No, honestly, so I'm really looking for some clarity here. So as I understood you, I'd like to hear you say just a little more about what you take authority to be on the Augustinian thomistic accounts and how it's different than, say, the modern accounts. As I understood you, it seemed like the modern account, you gave an account of authority where it's reasons that I would have to act in the absence of other reasons. So it's sort of like directive reasons. But it seemed like the problem with the modern account was basically that I would only grant that those reasons have legitimacy on the basis of my own willingness. So, insofar as those reasons fit with my self-image, and so it's really all about me at the end of the day. Is the Thomistic and Augustinian account, you tied it to truth.
Right.
But you tied what to truth? Like my question is, what's the actual nature of authority there? Is it still an account of reasons that I have to act in the absence of other reasons? Or is there actually something different about that classical conception of authority intrinsically that might explain some of these other social phenomena, such that beauty has its own authority, even if it's directed in a non-compelling way, like we tend to think of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in a way, okay, you didn't miss it because I didn't say it, right? So fair enough, right? Sure. Look, that attracts onto truth, right? That in the classical account. And I think even to some extent, right, you'd want to say that that's also not missing from the contemporary account. But I'll leave that aside just for a second, right? Because I think it just complicates things. That it tracks onto truth is another way of saying it tracks onto a certain kind of givenness of the way the world is, right, for the classical account. And the givenness of the way the world is revealed to us in this account in different ways. Beauty reveals it, right? Argument reveals it, and of course there are institutions that reveal it, right? Both in the personal sense, people, and also the church and so on. But there are reasons also given for why those different sources of authority are intelligible as sources of authority. I'm not sure if this is the force of the point, but if it is, I would certainly concede the idea that reasons are there, right? And reasons are never absent from this, right? So some of the reasons are exactly why you listen to your pastor, right? Even when you don't understand, right? And it's not like everybody needs to be capable of understanding, right? We understand that. There's lots of different reasons why people, for whatever reason, right? There are lots of different reasons why people will not understand the dictates of authority. And we can give reasons for why it's not necessary for them to do that, which are intelligible in terms of the givenness of certain things. Am I getting it's a great longer question to get at, and it does deserve.
Can I ask a question? I would like to just build on that.
Yeah.
I mean, everything you're saying about reason and authority tracks really well with my understanding of Thomas.
Yeah.
But there's another side to Augustine, and I'm thinking of that passage where he tells the story of Alexander the Great arresting a pirate, and Alexander's like, "What do you think you're doing being a pirate?" Right. And the pirate says, "Oh, please." Right? What do you think you're doing being an emperor? You're the same thing. Right?
Just writ large.
And then Augustine reflects in the abstract, all kingdoms are but bands of robbers.
Right.
And I don't see the reason there. I do see Romans 13 and obey those who are in authority, but it's not as if the authority tracks with reason.
you don't see the reason why we obey the king or the emperor as
Other than a
opposed to
command, other than a command to do so.
right. Yeah, and so would the question be at that point that, would the question, maybe I'm dense one at this point, would the question be at that point that we cannot provide a reason for why it's still appropriate to, to obey that?
Even an unjust king.
Right, because he's ordained right of God would be the explanation, and why should we do things that are ordained of God, and so on. Look, I don't know that confounds reason so much as raise, in my judgment, unless I'm missing it, as more as raise questions about the role of justice and governance, right? And presumably justice and reason at some point align, right? And Augustine seems to recognize that, I think, right?
Yeah,
even though we're going to have arguments about to what extent he thinks the point of governance is justice, as opposed to something other than justice, right? Which would be like O'Donovan, I think, right? If you read all of O'Donovan, he's got the lean, right? He's got the lean doctrine. It's right. Governance is not really about justice first and foremost, but about judgment, right? In like sort of an instance, we can't build the kingdom of God, right? That's built for us. Instead, what we're trying to do is make judgments, but they're still reasonable judgments, right? In part because of our relationship to a tradition, right? And the tradition is what helps us discern the reasonable judgments that we need. And I think, in these different spots.
Let's take Henry Lima and then Tom Hibbs, if we could, Henry.
Yeah, who's Henry?
Two of me.
Oh, sorry.
To what extent would you say this modern crisis of authority is due to a cultural change in the attitude towards authority versus a genuine failing of authoritative figures? And if it is due to a genuine failing, what's the correct classical response to that?
Yeah, so I think it's very modern to think it's about the failure of the individuals, right, in authorities. I think that's what we think. Like if these bishops and priests and so on and politicians would just be better, right? Then we'll give them the authority that they deserve. And I don't think it's primarily about that. I think it's a deeper cultural transformation, right? Where again, certain kinds of institutions and societies that have built themselves around, for instance, conceptions of tradition, right, have dissolved over time, and so they make up. They look to human beings. We look to human beings instead to bear the burden of this kind of authoritativeness. Be the kind of guy that we can believe in, right? And that's superhero, movies, right? And of course in a way the truth of contemporary superhero movies is these guys can't bear that burden, right? They're racked with anxiety over this. Like I'm just a doofus, like Spider-Man or whomever. We're like, I can't bear the burden of this kind of expectation from me. So in a way, they're kind of interesting in subverting, I think, what we expect. So I don't think it's primarily about failures. I think the failures just, as I said, kind of cement our sense that these institutions are just bereft of any meaning, sustaining capability where they may have been in the past.
So to follow up, what is the correct response to failures in institutions given the classical tradition? Just kind of play through.
In the classical tradition, prayer. Seriously, like if you think from within the Christian tradition, and especially Augustine's pretty clear about this, and Aquinas is, I think, as well. Like it's a sense of God's control of the situation, and something is being said to us by what's happening right now, right? In the failures of these institutions, the failures of these people, right? There's something being communicated, I think is the right word, right, to us by God that as believers we should be capable of reading and seeing and sustaining ourselves despite the failures. We don't generally think like that, right? We typically think, get them out, fix it, right? If we can't fix it, get them out, fix it again, that gets frustrating after a while, but it just seems to be getting worse and worse. Yeah, Tom, I think Tom, you said next? Yeah, and then that fellow right there. Yeah, after Tom, yep. Professor Hibbs.
Thanks, Joe. So I'm not sure exactly how to formulate this, but I'm wondering about the thesis that Hannah Arendt has, whom you began with.
Yeah.
In the origins of totalitarianism, that one of the conditions in modernity that makes us susceptible to totalitarianism is that what was once a marginal experience is now pervasive, and that's loneliness. Right? She focuses
That's what?
on loneliness.
Yeah.
What you just said about erosions of institutions and so forth might bear upon this, but I'm wondering if you have thoughts on the basis of these two approaches to authority, or your own thoughts about the sources of modern loneliness and the relationship to authority, and just how you would analyze that claim by Arendt that the increased experience of loneliness in modernity makes us susceptible to populism, fascism, totalitarianism,
Right.
and actually makes us susceptible to the worst forms of authoritarianism.
Right, and look, I think her analysis, and you're familiar with other analyses that are relatively similar, right? Will couple the term loneliness with alienation, right, as well. Sort of, the response of Marx and others to the same kind of problem. I think it's rooted in the loss of these institutions or these social cultures, these smaller social cultures that gave meaning to people. I think that's that's her analysis, and that's analysis of others, McIntyre, right, as well. That once you have like, if you look, the standard analysis of the French Revolution, to which I sort of pointed, once you have this collapse of these orders that provide meaning, right, and that they also obviously provide occupations, right? They provide, also like sort of a kind of busyness that is structured within something, and you assert the common equality of all human beings, independent of station and so on. The argument goes, you kind of cast people on their own lots, right? And whether it's Arendt or Maritain or any of these other figures, they all describe, Tocqueville and so on, right? They all describe, again, the kind of diminishment of the local communities that give meaning to people, right? And instead it's them versus the state, right? It's them in their relationship with a source of governing that is completely detached from them, and they have very, very little access to, right? They can't, remember McIntyre, I think it's McIntyre, right, who says, maybe it's in Ethics and Modernity, right? You have to hire specialists, right, to help you even navigate, right, through the state, right? Which we all know, right? Like, if you want to figure out, like, where did my tax money go, or how much do I owe, or do I get a refund, or whatever, right? You need to enlist specialists just to be able to get you through this maze of bureaucracy. So, is that getting at it? Is that Tom?
Hey Joe, fire a bill.
What's
Fire a bill.
this kid right here?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, as a Roman Catholic, in order to fill the void that I have with the authority, as you mentioned, what should I turn to? Should I turn to the strengthening and the advocation of the papacy in order to fill the authority in a more theological way, or turn the advocation of strengthening the federal government in order to tackle this from a more political point of view, in order to fill the authority that most of us have?
Well, I think turn to prayer. No, I think, look, I think you're, one way of arguing, again, going back to certain descriptions or ways of narrating what's happened is, this is exactly what the church does in reaction against this, is it strengthens the papacy, right? So the modern papacy that becomes the sort of central figure of Catholic institutional life is itself a consequence of a reaction against this dissolution over time of local churches, of bishops, right, episcopacies and so on. And it's a way the church herself tries to resist this corrosive power of the modern age on institutions, and also resist the state. So I guess what I'm saying is, you don't have to do it, right? It's already been done for you or being done. It's right. It's that kind of thing is happening at different levels. Now, look, I mean, what should you as a young man do? Not trouble yourself with it, right? I mean, focus your life on building something around you, right? Family or, friendships, relationships with people that are, meaningful, and work that's life-giving, and, because, right, I mean, this is happening at a higher level, like, to some extent we're talking about deep forces here and trying to diagnose what's happening. And thank God, neither you nor I are responsible for fixing them. Again, like I said to this young man in front of me, part of this, for Christians in particular, should be what's going on here, right? Trying to figure out what is going on here. What is the message that God is giving to us? And what are, the things that are being rebuked by what is happening? Like the thought that we can control all this, right? Seems to be pretty manifestly getting rebuked right now, right? I mean, to me, the great lesson of the pandemic is it's exposed our conception of control, right? And if you're not seeing that, I don't know what you're looking at, because I mean, if you assume good intentions, of most of the actors, which I think we should, right? I think you see, wow, we don't know what the heck we're doing still, right? We thought we knew so much, but we still don't know so much about viruses, transmission, disease curing, antibiotics. We still don't, like, there's a lot of lessons we should be learning. And I think that's the same for all this kind of stuff as well. Young man.
Yes. All right. So you talked about how we kind of need authority, and that authority is properly ordered when it's based on the truth that is relevant to structure. Yeah. And so I think as Christians we can safely say that, like, the greatest authority or the model authority would be God's authority over people, right? And so human authority, would you say that its structure based on truth is the way in which it reflects God's authority and is thus best structured in doing so? Since truth is
trying to model
God's
itself on
character.
the way on God's activity or Christ's activity even more proximately, right? I think that serves as a good model. It ought to serve as the model for Christians, but only a model, right? We're making an analogy to it, and we have to be careful about, careful to remind ourselves that it's only analogical, and our expectations for it have to be quite different, and perhaps even the exercise of it, right? Knowing the expectations should be different, should look different as well. And we should also look to natural institutions that we claim as Christians are natural, like the family and like politics, like life in political community. That's right. There's an essential claim, and I think also of Augustine, of the Christian community. These are natural to us, and we should look to those and see how, right, the shepherd, right, how he deals with his flock, or how parents relate to their children as models too. I have this fellow over here, and I'll come back to you. I don't want to be ignoring this row, or any young women, or who want to ask questions. Yeah.
Thanks for a very thought-provoking talk.
You're welcome.
So I'm wondering, to what extent do Augustine and Aquinas propose authority per se as a source of meaning? They both acknowledge the need for authority.
Yeah.
So whether that's the church's authority, which Augustine always comes back to, especially in Book 11 of the City of God.
Yeah, sure.
Describes the need for a mediator and a revelation and someone to pass on. So there's ecclesial authority, and then Aquinas gives a shockingly Machiavellian account of the need for authority. I'm not saying that's the only thing that's there, but when he discusses the rule of law, he even admits that most people will not be able to live in accord with a life of grace. They're going to need some kind of external force on them. He seems to be echoing Paul's letter to Timothy, or Titus perhaps, about the role that the law has to play, even though it would be better to not need the law, right? So there's two senses in which we need authority, but I'm not sure either of them suggests that authority itself is a source of meaning. but rather that there's something behind authority, which is the reason why we obey authority in the first place, that there's an object of devotion or veneration.
Yeah, sure.
So Augustine goes on in Book 19 to justify citizenship through the duty of charity, right, which is a duty derived from loving veneration of a holy God who loves you. But that wouldn't be deriving your meaning from the authority per se, because
Fair
otherwise
enough.
you have the danger of, well, you're just picking an arbitrary authority, right?
Right.
You just pick anything, and anything would be as good as anything else. In which case you might run into things that Arendt seemed to have been very concerned about. But so I guess I'm wondering, to what extent it makes sense to discuss this crisis of authority without reference to what's behind that authority? Do we derive meaning really from authority per se, or is it actually something noble that human beings think is worthy of being obeyed? That would be the more primary.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I don't disagree with that. I think that's right. Yeah. Yes. Agreed. Yes.
So essentially, I was wondering, you mentioned that as we've stopped adhering to authority on the basis that people do not trust or that they have departed from the truth. I was wondering if, essentially, do you think that the crisis of authority exists through the just wide social redefinition of what truth itself is? Because I mean, you see people all over social media kind of discussing that what this is my truth or something contrary to.
Sure.
So that's
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That's a good point. I mean, it's good to track language in the way you just spoke about it and see like the way that people speak and whether that's expressive of more fundamental things that they might hold, right? So I hear it all the time. Yeah, I never heard it before. It seems like until the past few years or so. This is my truth, and that's obviously a kind of subjectivist type claim, right? It makes it invulnerable to criticism. It's a kind of claim to you as the hearer. You can't really question this, right? I'm giving you what I happen to think about the world. So it's an assertion of my own authoritativeness with regard to my own life, right, or my own experience of life. One of the things I think that Augustine is particularly good for is questioning our capacity, even as individuals, right, to make claims about ourselves. Like if you really sit down and think about yourself, for long enough and well enough, you're gonna be like, holy crud! The discord I see in the world, right, actually is to some extent in me, and my truth today might not be my truth from 3 hours from now, or maybe it wasn't my truth yesterday, and I'm not sure it'll be that tomorrow. So I think there's all these great resources in our tradition for questioning exactly that kind of claim.
Let's take one more question, and maybe if you're willing to stand around for it afterwards,
Yeah, of
you
course.
get a chance to ask your question.
I'm at your disposal. 2 hands, or you're directing me to this fellow in the back? Okay, and then we'll come back to you. Okay? Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for this. This is really good. I'm similarly wondering.
Did I?
No.
Well, I'm going to blame her then.
I'm similarly wondering what you take political authority to mean, because I've heard it talked about as sort of this expert gloss, like I've heard about bureaucrats and specialists, or experts like the CDC, where we rely on these sorts of experts for certain sorts of specialized knowledge that we just can't have, and that seems totally right. Like that is a clear sense in which we need authorities because we're just really limited. But to me, that only seems like half the battle, because authorities in the relevant sense should be able to have like the power to coerce us to do things or stop us from doing things. Like the CDC, if it just acted on its own, not as a governmental entity, but just as an expert group that wants to tell me how to live well, they try to coerce me in some way, I feel like I have a right to resist that. There's no principled reason why them just being an authority qua experts means they can coerce me. And similarly, you might think like for the church, however Augustine or Aquinas were thinking of the church as an authority, they might be a sort of like moral or spiritual experts where they say, you have reasons to do X, Y, Z because they're morally good, they unite you to God. But it seems like an entirely different question as to whether or not they have the power to coerce me to do those things. And that seems, again, like a pretty important feature of authority, especially if we're thinking about how, Romans 13 is in any way relevant to what we think of authority right now, which, part of Romans 13 has a kind of coercive mechanism in stopping injustices. So do you have any thoughts about what's, like maybe what Aquinas or Augustine have said about filling in the gap as to why authorities aren't just like experts, but are actually entities that can coerce us to do things?
Right, and look, I think you're right. In fact, you might say that authorities are perhaps not even experts, right? The language of expertise might be a particular kind of language that is not essential to authoritativeness, right? So, I mean, like the bungling kings, right, and popes of history were no less kings and popes of history, despite being fools, right, and not competent. So expertise might not even be appropriate to it. It's something about the station, right, and its directive power with regard to our lives, including the possibility of sanction. I mean, forget about whether it can coerce our will, because I think that actually sort of raises another kind of question about the capacity of whether coercion can actually act on the will, right, to force people to act against their will, but whether they can sanction our behavior because we have chosen to disobey, right? And both the church and political authority historically have said, of course, right, these are essential features of what it means to be authoritative, right? So I think almost every Christian community has conceptions of the kinds of sanctions the community can exercise against people who act against the good of the community, right? Whether that's described as being heretical, right, in terms of certain kinds of beliefs, or just the sorts of activities human beings engage in, stealing money from the church, or engaging in adultery, or et cetera, right? So I think all of them would think that kind of capacity to be directive and to act to exercise power on behalf of the good, on behalf of the community over which it is an authority, would be features of authority. I think that's pretty common. Does that get to the question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I understand that authority should have some sort of coercive mechanism. I think my question is more or less like, what is the story that's told for why some authority has that kind of mechanism?
Right, and there will be different stories about this to some extent, and this may be partly too where you're going to see certain kinds of departures within Christian views, right? Some will be sin, right? That look, humans fail and they're nasty as a consequence of sin, and because of that we have to exercise force against them in order to drive the herd back together. Some may be less coercive based or something, or less coercive inclined, and this is just the nature of the good and the diversity of talents that are distributed among the people, right? This could be a kind of more Thomistic inflected way of seeing it, right? Which is there's just diversity of talents, and sometimes you just to be an authority is to be capable of acting and justified in pushing these other people, directing them, guiding them towards what is in fact good for them. So yeah, it's a good, very, very good question. Okay, you're last.
Yes. The sort of beginning of your talk, you kind of outlined how there were sort of two camps of where you get authority from, that kind of Enlightenment one where it stems from reason and personal choice, and then the kind of Augustinian and Thomistic view that it comes from truth, that it's heaven sent. I think, good or bad, authority is heaven sent. And then you mentioned the pandemic of 2020, how it was acted as this sort of great throwing open of a curtain to kind of reveal something.
Maybe in Texas it's over, not in Montgomery County, Maryland.
that there was, in fact, that we're being ruled under perhaps some sort of, imposition, a rule of imposition, I'd say, of vying groups. And it seems to me like a third kind of authority, separate from the Enlightenment reason or the Catholic, Thomistic, Augustine view of truth. But do you think that kind of rule of imposition comes from like a decay of authority, or do you believe that authority kind of always transitions towards imposition rather than the two kind of optimistic views of where they originate from?
Look, I guess I'm hearing the question, and the force of the question is being directed towards, is the exercise of authority always going to be decadent? Is it always going to decline or decay over time? Is that right? Is that really what you're asking?
Is it like within authority's nature to kind of turn sour and go bad and take a self-serving direction?
This may be where the distinction introduced by the fellow in the back might be helpful. Like, in essence, no, I don't think so, but in practice, because we're talking about human beings exercising authority, probably, right? Maybe yes, simply. And it's not so much, the power corrupts type, concern, just that something about the way we live in community, right, as human beings, as fallen human beings, inclines to dissolution over time, and I don't really, I don't have a handy explanation as to why, but I think that if that's your instinct, that's probably right, or I would think that might be